The rain struck the cathedral windows, like fingers seeking entry to sacred ground. Inside, beneath the weight of stone arches that had witnessed centuries of confession, she pressed her palms against the cold marble altar, feeling the vibrations of his approaching footsteps through her bones. The air between them thickened with unspoken words, heavy as incense, while shadows cast by flickering candles danced across her face like secrets refusing to stay buried. He stopped 3 paces behind her, close enough that his breath stirred the air at her neck, yet distant as a star she could never touch. The carriage wheels carved silence into the muddy path as they brought her to Thornwick Manor beneath a sky the color of old pewter. She arrived like morning mist, with nothing but the dress on her back and a small leather satchel that held the remnants of a life others had deemed finished. The iron gates groaned open with the reluctance of metal that remembers rust, while gravel beneath the horses' hooves whispered secrets to the earth. The servants who received her moved with practiced efficiency, their eyes sliding past her face, as if she were made of glass they feared might shatter. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, descended marble steps with the measured grace of a funeral procession, keys jangling at her waist like wind chimes announcing sorrow. Behind her, the manor's windows stared down like hollow eyes, reflecting nothing yet suggesting depths that daylight could never reach. Miss Cordelia Ashworth stood before the imposing facade with the stillness of someone who had learned resignation too young. Her dark hair caught no light, and her eyes held the color of storm clouds gathering over distant moors. There was something in her bearing that spoke of strength carefully hidden beneath layers of learned deference, a quality that made the air around her feel both fragile and immutable. The manor house breathed around them as they crossed the threshold, its walls exhaling accumulated silence. Portraits lined the hallway like sentries, their painted eyes following footsteps across Persian rugs worn thin by countless souls. Afternoon light, filtered through mullioned windows, cast shifting patterns that seemed to pulse with the house's own heartbeat. Her room was in the east wing, Mrs. Blackwood explained in tones suggesting both kindness and judgment. The chamber was small but clean, with a narrow bed beneath a window overlooking the gardens. From this vantage point, she could see the maze of hedgerows that stretched toward the forest edge, their geometric precision contrasting sharply with the wild tangle of branches beyond. As evening approached, the manor settled into itself like an old woman adjusting her shawls. Servants moved through corridors with ghostly efficiency, lighting lamps and drawing curtains against approaching darkness. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by thick carpets, creating an atmosphere of hushed reverence that spoke of a household where silence was not merely preferred, but required. She had been brought here as companion to Lady Margaret Thornwick, an elderly woman whose mind had begun to wander the shadowy paths of memory like a traveler lost in familiar territory. The arrangement had been made through intermediaries, reducing her circumstances to ink marks on parchment. She was to provide company, to read aloud from approved volumes, to sit quietly while the old woman dozed by the fire. The master of the house remained a mystery in those first days, a presence felt rather than seen. Lord Thornwick was away on business. The servants whispered, though they spoke of his absence with careful neutrality that suggested his return would change the very atmosphere of the manor. His portrait dominated the great hall, showing a man with dark eyes that seemed to follow observers, features carved with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed, without question. Lady Margaret proved to be a woman suspended between worlds, her lucid moments interspersed with journeys into a past that seemed more real than the present. She would speak of parties that had ended decades ago as if the music still played in the next room, of conversations with people long dead as if they had just stepped away for a moment. During these episodes, Cordelia learned to sit quietly, her presence serving as a gentle anchor. The gardens became her refuge during long afternoons when Lady Margaret napped. She would walk gravel paths between beds of late-blooming roses, their petals heavy with approaching autumn. The maze drew her repeatedly, its carefully trimmed walls creating corridors of green silence where she could disappear from the watching windows of the manor. At its center stood a marble fountain, dry for years, its carved figures frozen in eternal dance. It was in the maze that she first truly felt his presence, though she saw nothing more than the flutter of curtains in an upper window. The sensation was unmistakable, like standing too close to a fire whose heat reached her skin before flames became visible. She had been reading beside the fountain, her book balanced on her knees while late afternoon sunlight filtered through hedge walls in patterns that shifted like living lace. The feeling of being observed came gradually, a pressure at the back of her neck that made her spine straighten and breathing grow shallow. When she looked up, the manor's windows stared back with their usual blank regard, yet something had changed in the quality of silence. It was no longer empty but expectant, like a theater moments before the curtain rises. That evening, Mrs. Blackwood announced that the master would return the following day. The news traveled through servant quarters like ripples in still water, causing a subtle shift in the manor's rhythm. Preparations began immediately. Silver was polished until it reflected candlelight like captured stars, carpets beaten until they released no dust, windows cleaned until they disappeared like barriers between inside and outside. Cordelia found herself caught between curiosity and apprehension, her imagination filling empty spaces where knowledge should have been. She had heard fragments of conversation among servants, carefully neutral observations that revealed more through what they didn't say. He was a fair master, they agreed, though fairness in such a man might wear a different face than in others. He valued competence and discretion above warmth, expected his household to run like a well-tuned instrument. The night before his return, she dreamed of footsteps in empty corridors, of doors opening to reveal rooms filled with shadow and possibility. She woke with the taste of storm clouds on her tongue and the certainty that her life at Thornwick Manor was about to undergo a transformation as inevitable as the changing of seasons. Through her window, the gardens lay silver beneath moonlight, their familiar paths transformed into something mysterious and strange. The morning arrived wrapped in mist that clung to the manor's walls like a living thing, reluctant to release its hold on ancient stones. Cordelia woke to the sound of carriage wheels on gravel. Though the fog was so thick she could see nothing from her window, but gray shapes moving like ghosts through a world drained of color. The sound echoed off the manor's walls and seemed to reverberate through her bones. Below, she could hear the sudden acceleration of activity as the household roused itself to receive its master. Footsteps hurried along corridors with purpose they had lacked for weeks, and voices carried an undertone of urgency that spoke of a domain suddenly coming to life after dormancy. Even the manor itself seemed to straighten, as if the building were a creature that had been merely dozing and now awakened to full awareness. Mrs. Blackwood's knock came precisely at 7, followed by her voice announcing that Lord Thornwick had requested all household members present themselves in the great hall after breakfast. The formality of the summons sent a chill through Cordelia's chest, though she could not have said why. There was nothing unusual in a master wishing to review his household after an absence, yet something in Mrs. Blackwood's careful neutrality suggested this gathering would be different. Lady Margaret was in one of her clearer periods that morning, her eyes focused on the present moment with the sharpness of someone surfacing from deep water. She sat by her bedroom window, watching the mist slowly retreat from the gardens like an army withdrawing after a siege. Her fingers worked constantly at the embroidery in her lap, creating patterns that seemed to follow no earthly design. "He's returned," Lady Margaret said without looking up from her needlework. Her voice carried no particular emotion, yet there was something in its quality that made Cordelia pause. "I can always tell. The house changes when he's here. It remembers what it was built for." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, carrying implications that Cordelia couldn't quite grasp. She had learned not to question Lady Margaret's observations too closely, as they often contained truths that became apparent only in retrospect. Instead, she poured tea with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, the delicate clink of china the only sound breaking the morning's unusual stillness. The great hall felt different when Cordelia descended the main staircase an hour later. Morning light, filtering through tall windows, created columns of illumination that seemed to divide the space into distinct territories of shadow and revelation. The servants had assembled in a neat line along one wall, their faces carefully composed in expressions of respectful attention. Mrs. Blackwood stood slightly apart, her bearing suggesting both authority and deference. Lord Thornwick stood before the massive fireplace, though no fire burned in the grate. He was taller than his portrait had suggested, with the kind of presence that seemed to expand beyond the physical boundaries of his form. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his eyes held depths that reminded Cordelia of winter lakes, beautiful and potentially treacherous. When he moved, it was with controlled grace. His gaze moved along the assembled line of servants with methodical attention. When it reached Cordelia, standing slightly apart at the foot of the staircase, it paused. The silence in the hall deepened, becoming something almost tangible, like fabric pressed against skin. She felt herself being measured by standards she couldn't comprehend, evaluated according to criteria that existed in the complex calculus of his private judgment. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and her name in his voice sounded different than it had in any other mouth, as if he had discovered syllables in it that she herself had never heard. "I trust you have found your position here satisfactory." The question seemed to contain multitudes, though its surface remained perfectly calm. Cordelia inclined her head in acknowledgement, not trusting her voice to emerge with the steadiness she wished to project. Something in his manner suggested that her response mattered more than mere politeness would account for, that this seemingly simple exchange was actually a test whose parameters she couldn't identify. "Lady Margaret speaks well of your companionship," he continued, moving closer with steps that made no sound on the marble floor. "She values quietness in those around her. It seems you possess that quality naturally." There was something in the way he spoke the word quietness that gave it weight beyond its ordinary meaning. Cordelia felt herself being drawn into a conversation that was taking place on multiple levels simultaneously, where every word carried implications that danced just beyond her understanding. The air between them seemed to thicken, becoming charged with possibilities that had no names. He studied her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable as ancient stone. Then, with a gesture that somehow managed to be both dismissive and inclusive, he addressed the assembled household. His instructions were clear and efficiently delivered. The manor would be hosting guests within the fortnight. Arrangements must be made for their accommodation, and every aspect of the household's operation must reflect the standards of excellence that the Thornwick name demanded. As the servants dispersed to begin their preparations, Cordelia found herself lingering in the great hall, uncertain whether she had been dismissed or was expected to remain. Lord Thornwick had moved to one of the tall windows, his silhouette dark against the slowly brightening morning beyond. The mist was lifting from the gardens, revealing the maze in patches, like memories surfacing from half-forgotten dreams. "The maze interests you," he said without turning, though she was certain she had made no sound that might have revealed her thoughts. His observation fell into the silence between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread far beyond the immediate moment. "It provides a peaceful place for reflection, my lord," she replied, though even as she spoke, she realized that peaceful might not be the most accurate description of her experiences there. The maze held something more complex than peace, a quality that was both soothing and unsettling, like standing at the edge of an ocean whose depths remained forever hidden. He turned then, and she found herself caught in the direct force of his attention like a small creature suddenly illuminated by lamplight. "Reflection can be dangerous," he said, his voice carrying undertones that seemed to echo from some deeper chamber of meaning. "It shows us things we might prefer to leave unexamined." The words hung between them, creating a space that felt both intimate and vast. Cordelia sensed that she stood at the threshold of something that could not be unnamed once acknowledged, a doorway that, once passed through, would change the very nature of her existence at Thornwick Manor. Underscore. 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 The preparations for Lord Thornwick's guests transformed the manor into a hive of controlled activity, each servant moving with the precision of dancers who had rehearsed their steps until they became instinctive. Cordelia watched from her position on the periphery as rooms were aired and cleaned, as silver was polished until it threw back reflections like captured starlight, as linens were pressed and arranged with the care usually reserved for sacred vestments. Lady Margaret grew increasingly agitated as the day of arrival approached, her usual drift between past and present becoming more pronounced, as if the approaching disruption to the manor's routine had somehow disturbed the delicate balance of her inner world. She would speak of parties from decades past as if they were happening in the next room, of guests who had been dead for years as if they might walk through the door at any moment. "They come like ravens," Lady Margaret murmured one afternoon as she sat by her window, watching the servants hang garlands of autumn leaves along the garden paths. Her needle moved through the fabric in her lap with mechanical precision, creating patterns that seemed to follow some inner logic visible only to her. Black wings and bright eyes, settling on everything until nothing remains unchanged. The words sent an inexplicable chill through Cordelia's chest, though she told herself they were merely the wanderings of a mind that had lost its moorings in the present. Yet there was something in Lady Margaret's tone that suggested a clarity that transcended her usual confusion, as if in her displacement from ordinary time she had access to truths that were hidden from those anchored too firmly in the immediate moment. The guests arrived on a Thursday afternoon, when the sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of rain that never quite fulfilled itself. Cordelia watched from her window as carriage after carriage rolled up the gravel drive, disgorging passengers dressed in the somber elegance that marked them as members of Lord Thornwick's social circle. Among them, one figure caught and held her attention with surprising intensity. A woman emerged from the final carriage with the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. Her hair was the color of midnight, swept up in an elaborate style that somehow managed to appear both formal and effortless. Her dress, though properly modest, was cut with precision that revealed elegant lines without ever crossing the boundaries of propriety. The woman was introduced, Cordelia learned from the servants' whispered conversations, as Lady Vivian Ashcroft, a widow of impeccable reputation whose family connections made her a valuable addition to any gathering. She had known Lord Thornwick for years, their friendship dating back to their youth, and her presence at Thornwick Manor was both expected and somehow significant in ways that the servants seemed to understand without needing to speak them aloud. That evening, as the guests gathered in the drawing room for dinner, Cordelia found herself relegated to the upper reaches of the manor, dining alone in her small chamber while the sounds of conversation and laughter drifted up from below. The isolation felt more pronounced than usual, as if the presence of the guests had somehow emphasized her position as neither family nor servant, suspended in a liminal space that belonged fully to neither world. She was arranging Lady Margaret's evening medications when a soft knock came at her door. Mrs. Blackwood entered with her usual measured dignity, carrying a tray that held not the simple fare Cordelia had expected, but delicacies clearly prepared in the manor's main kitchen. The housekeeper's expression remained carefully neutral, but there was something in her manner that suggested this was more than simple hospitality. "His lordship requests that you join the guests in the drawing-room after dinner," Mrs. Blackwood announced, her tone giving no indication of whether this was an honor or a burden. Lady Margaret will be brought down as well. He believes the company might be beneficial for her. The words struck Cordelia with an impact that seemed disproportionate to their simple content. The prospect of entering the drawing room, filled with Lord Thornwick's sophisticated guests, felt like stepping onto a stage for which she had never rehearsed, where the rules of performance were unknown to her but crucial to survival. "There is a dress," Mrs. Blackwood continued, gesturing toward the bed, where Cordelia now noticed a garment laid out with careful precision. His lordship thought it might be suitable for the occasion. The dress was beautiful in a way that made Cordelia's breath catch in her throat. Made of deep blue silk that seemed to capture and hold the lamplight like water, it was cut in a style that was both modest and elegant, with lines that would flatter without calling undue attention to themselves. That Lord Thornwick had thought to provide such a garment created a flutter of confusion in her chest that she couldn't quite name. The drawing room, when she finally descended to it, was ablaze with candles that turned every surface into a field of shifting light and shadow. The guests were arranged in small clusters, their conversation creating a gentle murmur that rose and fell like waves against a distant shore. Lady Margaret sat in a chair by the fire, looking more alert than she had in days, as if the presence of company had called her back from whatever distant country her mind usually wandered. Lord Thornwick stood near the windows, a glass of wine in his hand catching the light like liquid amber. When Cordelia entered, his gaze found her immediately, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She felt herself being assessed once again, though this time the evaluation seemed to carry a different quality, as if he were confirming some private hypothesis rather than forming an initial judgment. Lady Vivian approached her with the kind of predatory grace that beautiful women often possessed, her smile warm and welcoming while her eyes remained calculating. "You must be Miss Ashworth," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had never needed to raise it to command attention. "I've heard so much about your devoted care of dear Lady Margaret. Such a noble calling for one so young." The words, though perfectly polite, carried undertones that made Cordelia's skin prickle with awareness. She found herself being categorized, placed into whatever social framework allowed Lady Vivian to understand, and therefore control her. The conversation that followed was like a careful dance, each participant testing the boundaries of the interaction while maintaining the facade of casual politeness. As the evening progressed, Cordelia became increasingly aware of the undercurrents flowing through the room, like invisible streams. The guests seemed to arrange themselves according to some complex social geography that took into account not just their relationships to each other, but their various connections to Lord Thornwick himself. Lady Vivian remained at the center of these arrangements like a sun around which the other planets orbited. The evening reached its climax when Lady Margaret, roused perhaps by some memory triggered by the social atmosphere, began to speak about the manor's history with a clarity that surprised everyone present. Her voice took on the cadences of a practiced storyteller as she described balls and gatherings from decades past, bringing to life a world of glittering elegance that seemed to shimmer just beyond the reach of the present moment. "This room has seen such romance," Lady Margaret said, her eyes bright with memories that seemed more real to her than the faces surrounding her. Secret meetings and whispered promises, hearts broken and mended within these very walls. The stones remember everything. You know, they hold the echoes of every word spoken in passion or despair. Her words fell into a silence that seemed to expand beyond the physical boundaries of the room, creating a space where past and present existed simultaneously. Cordelia felt the weight of those accumulated memories pressing against her consciousness like water against a dam, threatening to overflow into the carefully maintained order of the present evening. It was then that Lord Thornwick spoke, his voice cutting through the charged atmosphere with the precision of a blade through silk. Some echoes are better left undisturbed, he said, though whether his words were meant as warning or invitation remained unclear. His gaze met Cordelia's across the room, and in that moment she understood that whatever had begun between them in their brief exchanges was about to evolve into something that could no longer be ignored. The morning after the dinner party dawned with a crystalline clarity that made every detail of the gardens stand out with unusual sharpness. Cordelia woke with a peculiar sense of displacement, as if she had crossed some invisible threshold during the evening's events, and now found herself in territory that was both familiar and fundamentally changed. Lady Margaret was in one of her distant moods, her attention focused on something beyond the physical boundaries of her chamber. She sat by her window, with her embroidery forgotten in her lap, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass as she watched the morning shadows retreat across the lawn. "She marked you last night," Lady Margaret said without preamble, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone she used when discussing weather or household arrangements. "I saw her watching, measuring, like a cat deciding whether to play with its prey, or simply devour it." The words sent an unexpected chill through Cordelia's chest, though she wasn't entirely certain to whom Lady Margaret was referring. The old woman's pronouncements often combined insight with confusion in ways that made them difficult to interpret, yet there was something in her tone that suggested a clarity that transcended her usual displacement. A knock at the chamber door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Blackwood entered with her usual measured dignity, though Cordelia noticed a slight tension in the housekeeper's bearing that suggested news of some significance. In her hands she carried a sealed letter, its cream-colored paper bearing the unmistakable marks of quality stationery. "For you, miss," Mrs. Blackwood said, extending the letter with an expression that managed to convey both curiosity and disapproval. Delivered by Lady Vivian's personal maid with instructions that it required immediate attention. The message was brief and ostensibly friendly, an invitation to join Lady Vivian for a morning walk through the gardens. The tone was perfectly appropriate, expressing interest in becoming better acquainted with someone who had proven so devoted to Lady Margaret's care. Yet something in the carefully chosen words suggested undercurrents that made Cordelia's pulse quicken with apprehension rather than pleasure. An hour later, she found herself walking the gravel paths of the Manor's gardens beside Lady Vivian, who moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. The morning air carried the scent of late roses and dying leaves, creating an atmosphere of melancholy beauty that seemed to mirror the complex emotions swirling through Cordelia's chest. "You handle Lady Margaret so skillfully," Lady Vivian observed as they paused beside a fountain where water trickled over carved stone figures worn smooth by decades of weather. "It requires a special kind of patience to care for someone whose mind has begun to wander. I confess I've never possessed such virtues myself." They had reached the entrance to the maze, its trimmed hedge walls creating corridors of green shadow that seemed to beckon with promises of privacy and secrecy. Lady Vivian paused at the threshold, her hand trailing along the hedge, as if testing the firmness of the barrier it created between the ordered world of the gardens and whatever lay hidden within its geometric confines. "I wonder if you might indulge my curiosity about something," Lady Vivian said, her tone shifting subtly to convey a more serious intent. "I've noticed that Lord Thornwick seems to take a particular interest in your welfare. Such attention from a man of his position is unusual. I hope you understand the delicate nature of such a situation." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread far beyond their immediate impact. Cordelia felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized that her instinctive sense of danger had been correct. This was indeed a trap, though its precise nature was only now becoming clear. Lady Vivian was staking a claim, marking territory, warning away potential competition. Before she could formulate a reply, the sound of approaching footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of another person. Both women turned to see Lord Thornwick walking toward them with his characteristic unhurried pace, though something in his bearing suggested that his appearance at this moment was not entirely coincidental. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying its usual controlled authority while his eyes lingered on Cordelia's face with an intensity that made her aware of the heat still burning in her cheeks. "I hope you found the gardens pleasant this morning." "Indeed, my lord," Lady Vivian replied, her manner shifting smoothly back to its earlier warmth as if the previous conversation had never taken place. "Miss Ashworth has been a delightful companion. We were just discussing the challenges of caring for elderly relatives. Such a noble calling, requiring such dedication and discretion." The last word was delivered with an emphasis that transformed it from observation to warning, though anyone not privy to the earlier conversation might have missed its significance entirely. Lord Thornwick's expression remained unchanged, yet something in the quality of his attention shifted, becoming more focused, as if he were reading meanings in the spaces between words. "Discretion is indeed valuable," he said, his gaze moving deliberately between the two women. "Though one must be careful not to mistake silence for consent, or gentleness for weakness. Sometimes what appears to be vulnerability is actually strength that has not yet chosen to reveal itself." The words fell into the morning air, with the weight of pronouncement, creating a charged silence that seemed to expand beyond the immediate boundaries of their conversation. Lady Vivian's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, while Cordelia felt something shift in her chest, as if a door she hadn't known existed had suddenly opened to reveal possibilities she had never dared to consider. When they were alone, Lord Thornwick moved closer to the maze entrance, his fingers trailing along the hedge wall in an absent gesture that somehow managed to convey both restlessness and deliberation. The morning light, filtering through the leaves, created patterns of shadow and illumination across his face that emphasized the strong lines of his features, while hiding his eyes in depths that seemed to hold secrets she was only beginning to suspect. "Walk with me," he said, gesturing toward the maze entrance. It was not quite a command, though the assumption of compliance was clear. There are things that can only be said away from windows and listening ears. The maze closed around them like a green cathedral, its walls creating a sense of isolation that was both peaceful and intense. The gravel paths muffled their footsteps, while the hedge walls rose high enough to block any view of the manor or its watching windows. They were suspended in a world of geometric precision and natural wildness, where cultivated order battled constantly with the tendency of living things to exceed their designated boundaries. They had reached the center of the maze, where the dry fountain stood with its carved figures frozen in eternal dance. The morning light, filtered through the hedge walls, created an atmosphere of green-tinted twilight that seemed to exist outside ordinary time. "You see more than most people would credit you with seeing," he said, his voice dropping to a lower register that seemed to resonate through the enclosed space. "That can be a dangerous gift, particularly for someone in a vulnerable position." "Is that a warning, my lord?" she asked, turning to face him fully for the first time since they had entered the maze. In the filtered light, his features seemed both sharper and softer, as if the green shadows had revealed aspects of his character that daylight usually concealed. "Perhaps," he replied, though his tone suggested something more complex than simple caution. "Or perhaps it's recognition of the fact that you're not as vulnerable as you appear. There's strength in you that most people miss because they see only what they expect to see." The words created a space between them that felt both vast and intimate, as if they were standing on opposite shores of a river that might be crossed if either of them chose to take the necessary steps. Cordelia felt her heart hammering against her ribs with an intensity that seemed to echo through her entire body. "Marcus," she said, using his given name for the first time without permission or invitation, the word falling from her lips like a confession. "I think we both know that what exists between us has moved far beyond the boundaries of simple employer and employee, but I also know that acknowledging it could destroy everything we've built here. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could smell the scent of rain and earth that clung to his clothes. "What if I told you," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "that some things are worth the risk of destruction, that some possibilities are worth pursuing even when we cannot see where they might lead?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning an abyss, solid enough to cross yet requiring a leap of faith that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose, and when she didn't, his fingers traced the line of her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch in her throat. "I have fought this," he murmured, his voice rough with emotions he had clearly been holding in check. "I have told myself that it was inappropriate, that it could only lead to complications neither of us could handle. But I realized that some truths cannot be denied indefinitely." "And what truth is that?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That I have fallen in love with you," he said simply, the words falling into the morning light like stones into still water. "Completely and irrevocably, despite every rational argument against it. And I believe, I hope, that you might feel something similar." The confession hung between them like a door that, once opened, could never be closed again. "I do," she whispered, the words barely audible, yet carrying more weight than any declaration she had ever made. "I love you too, though I know it's impossible, though I know it could destroy everything." "Then we'll build something new," he said, and suddenly his arms were around her, pulling her against his chest, where she could hear the rapid beating of his heart that matched the acceleration of her own. "Something that belongs to us, that doesn't depend on the approval of people who would never understand what we've found together." For a moment, they stood suspended in the golden light of the maze, holding each other as if they could stop time through sheer force of will. But even as Cordelia allowed herself to sink into the warmth of his embrace, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that eyes both friendly and hostile were cataloging this moment for future use. The afternoon brought unexpected complication in the form of a carriage arriving without warning, its polished surface reflecting autumn sunlight like a mirror as it rolled up the gravel drive toward Thornwick Manor. From Lady Margaret's window, Cordelia could see the vehicle's expensive appointments and quality horses, suggesting passengers of significant social standing who possessed the confidence to arrive unannounced. Mrs. Blackwood's knock came within minutes, followed by her entrance with news that carried implications beyond mere social inconvenience. Her usually impeccable composure showed signs of strain, as if the day's events had begun to exceed her capacity for maintaining seamless operation. "Begging your pardon, Lady Margaret," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice carrying undertones of controlled urgency. "But his lordship requests that you join him in the drawing-room to receive some visitors who've arrived unexpectedly. Family members," he said, though he didn't specify which branch of the family tree might be represented. The mention of family created tension in Lady Margaret's bearing that was immediately apparent, as if certain names or faces had the power to call her back from whatever distant territory her mind usually wandered. Her fingers gripped the arms of her chair with sudden intensity, while her eyes took on a focus that spoke of emotions held carefully in check. "Which family members?" Lady Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she might already suspect the answer. "Lord Cornelius Thornwick and his daughter Miss Evangeline," Mrs. Blackwood replied, her carefully neutral expression not quite concealing her own apprehension about the implications of such an arrival. "They mentioned urgent business that required immediate attention, though they weren't more specific about its nature." The names fell into the afternoon silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread through the very walls of the manor. Cordelia felt something shift in the atmosphere around them, as if the approaching visitors carried with them possibilities for disruption that went far beyond mere social inconvenience. "Uncle Cornelius," Lady Margaret murmured, her voice carrying tones of memory that seemed to span decades. Marcus's uncle, heir presumptive to the estate if anything should happen to our dear boy. And Evangeline, his daughter, such a lovely child, though she must be a woman grown by now. I wonder what brings them here so unexpectedly. An hour later, Cordelia found herself following Lady Margaret down the manor's main staircase toward the drawing room, where voices could already be heard in animated conversation. The quality of those voices suggested tensions that had been building for some time, as if this unexpected visit was merely the latest chapter in a longer story of family discord and competing interests. The drawing room, when they entered, was arranged like a stage set for drama. Marcus stood near the fireplace with his characteristic, controlled bearing, though something in his posture suggested emotions held in check rather than genuine calm. Near the windows, a man who could only be Lord Cornelius Thornwick held court with the kind of expansive gestures that indicated someone accustomed to commanding attention through sheer force of personality. Lord Cornelius was perhaps 15 years older than Marcus, with silver-threaded hair and features that shared enough resemblance to suggest close kinship, while differing enough to create an impression of entirely different character. Where Marcus possessed an intensity that was carefully contained, his uncle radiated a confidence that seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. Beside him stood a young woman who could only be his daughter Evangeline, and Cordelia felt her breath catch as she took in the striking figure she presented. Evangeline Thornwick possessed the kind of beauty that seemed to have been crafted rather than born, with golden hair arranged in elaborate coils and features that belonged in classical paintings. Her dress was the height of fashion, cut to display both her figure and her family's wealth to maximum advantage. "Aunt Margaret!" Evangeline exclaimed, crossing the room with movements that managed to convey both affection and theatrical performance. "How wonderful you look! Country air has clearly been beneficial to your health." Lady Margaret accepted her great-niece embrace with the grace of someone who recognized social theater when she encountered it, though her response carried warmth that seemed genuine despite its careful modulation. "Evangeline, dear child, you've grown into quite the accomplished young lady. And Cornelius, what an unexpected pleasure." Lord Cornelius bowed over Lady Margaret's hand with flourishes that belonged to an earlier era, his manner suggesting someone who had learned courtly behavior from books rather than natural inclination. "My dear sister-in-law, you look remarkably well for someone who has endured such challenges. We've been concerned about your welfare, naturally, particularly given the isolation of this place." The words carried undertones that transformed apparent concern into something more pointed, though the criticism remained carefully veiled beneath layers of familial solicitude. Marcus's expression darkened almost imperceptibly, while Cordelia found herself positioning herself slightly behind Lady Margaret as if seeking protection from whatever storm was gathering in the elegant drawing room. "How kind of you to be concerned," Marcus said, his voice carrying its usual controlled authority while acquiring an edge that cut through the afternoon air like a blade through silk. "Though I'm curious about what urgent business might have required such an unexpected journey." Lord Cornelius's smile never wavered, though something flickered in his eyes that suggested calculations being performed behind the facade of avuncular warmth. "Ah, my dear nephew, some matters are too delicate for correspondence. They require the personal touch, frank discussion that can only take place face to face." Evangeline had positioned herself near the tea service, her movements as she arranged cups creating a performance of domestic competence that seemed designed to emphasize her suitability for managing a great household. "We've been hearing such interesting reports about the goings-on at Thornwick Manor," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that beautiful women often cultivated, "about unusual additions to the household, about changes in established routines." The words fell into the drawing room like sparks into dry kindling, creating a tension that was almost visible in the charged air between the assembled family members. Cordelia felt her cheeks burn with the sudden understanding that she herself was the subject of these veiled references, that her presence at Thornwick Manor had somehow become a matter of family concern that warranted investigation. "I'm not certain I understand your meaning," Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he understood perfectly well. "The household operates according to the same principles it always has. Lady Margaret requires companionship, and Miss Ashworth has proven admirably suited to providing it." "Oh, I'm sure she has," Evangeline said, her gaze moving to Cordelia for the first time since their entrance to the drawing room. The assessment was thorough and somehow intimate, as if she were evaluating not just Cordelia's appearance, but her potential for causing complications in whatever plans the visitors had brought with them. Such a devoted companion, though one wonders if such devotion might extend beyond purely professional duties. The insinuation hung in the afternoon air like poison disguised as perfume, creating a silence that seemed to expand until it filled not just the drawing room, but the entire manor. Cordelia felt her hands tremble slightly as she realized that the careful balance she and Marcus had been maintaining was about to be subjected to scrutiny from people who had the power to destroy everything they had built together. "Miss Ashworth's character is beyond reproach," Marcus said, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made even Lord Cornelius shift uncomfortably. "I will not have it questioned by anyone, family or otherwise. If you have concerns about the management of this household, I suggest you address them directly rather than hiding behind innuendo and speculation." The defense, delivered with controlled fury that spoke of emotions barely held in check, nevertheless created ripples of consequence that would spread far beyond the immediate moment. Lord Cornelius's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, as if he had received confirmation of suspicions he had hoped would prove unfounded, while Evangeline's eyes glittered with something that might have been triumph. The evening meal was a masterpiece of controlled tension, with each course served against a backdrop of conversation that carried undercurrents sharp enough to cut crystal. The dining room's candlelight created islands of warm illumination that seemed to emphasize the carefully maintained distances between the assembled family members, while shadows gathered in the corners like observers waiting to witness whatever drama was building toward its inevitable climax. Lord Cornelius dominated the conversation with the skill of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of family politics, his observations seeming innocent enough on their surface while carrying implications that grew more pointed with each carefully chosen word. Evangeline supported her father's conversational gambits with practiced grace that transformed dining into a form of warfare conducted with silver utensils and crystal glasses. "The estate appears to be thriving under your management, Marcus," Lord Cornelius observed as the soup course was removed and replaced with delicately prepared fish. "Though I confess to some curiosity about certain innovations in household management that have come to our attention." Marcus's response was measured, though Cordelia could see the tension in the set of his shoulders and the careful way he placed his fork beside his plate. "I'm always interested in improving efficiency and ensuring the comfort of those under my care. If you have specific concerns, I encourage you to voice them directly." Evangeline leaned forward slightly, her movement causing the candlelight to catch the elaborate arrangement of her golden hair and the pearls at her throat. "Oh, Marcus, you know how families worry. We've heard such interesting tales about the unusual degree of personal attention you've been showing to certain members of the household staff." The words fell into the dining room like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread through the very walls of the manor. Cordelia felt her breathing grow shallow as she realized that whatever careful privacy she and Marcus had maintained was about to be stripped away by people who saw their connection as a threat to be eliminated. "The care of Lady Margaret requires constant attention," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a warning that would have deterred anyone less determined than his relatives. Miss Ashworth has proven invaluable in that regard, and I will not have her dedication questioned by those who have shown little interest in Lady Margaret's welfare until now." Lord Cornelius's smile never wavered, though something in his eyes suggested calculations being performed that went far beyond the immediate conversation. "Naturally, we're grateful for Miss Ashworth's dedication, though one might wonder if such close attention to duty might not create complications that could prove embarrassing to the family." The threat, wrapped in language so elegant that its true nature might have been missed by anyone not listening carefully to the undertones, hung in the candle-warmed air like incense that concealed the scent of poison. Lady Margaret, who had been silent through most of the meal, suddenly spoke with a clarity that cut through the diplomatic maneuvering like a blade through silk. "How tedious it becomes," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived decades of family intrigue, "when people speak in circles rather than saying what they mean. Cornelius, if you have something to say about my companion, please have the courtesy to speak plainly." The directness of the challenge created a moment of stunned silence, as if Lady Margaret had stripped away all pretense and forced the conversation into territory where subtlety was no longer possible. Lord Cornelius's carefully maintained composure flickered for just an instant, revealing something harder and more calculating beneath the surface charm. "Very well," he said, setting down his wine glass with deliberate precision. "There have been reports, from reliable sources, suggesting that Marcus has developed an inappropriate attachment to Miss Ashworth. Such a relationship, if it exists, would be scandalous enough to damage the family's reputation irreparably." The accusation hung in the air, like a sword suspended by a thread, ready to fall and sever whatever bonds of civility had been holding the evening together. Cordelia felt the blood drain from her face as every eye in the room turned toward her, assessing, judging, measuring her worthiness to be the cause of such family discord. Marcus rose from his seat with the controlled grace of a predator preparing to strike, his movements so fluid and dangerous that even Lord Cornelius seemed to recognize the precipice he had approached. "Uncle," he said, his voice carrying a deadly quiet that was more threatening than any shout could have been, "you have precisely one opportunity to withdraw that accusation and apologize to Miss Ashworth for the insult you have just delivered." "I think not," Lord Cornelius replied, though there was a tremor in his voice that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of the forces he had set in motion. "The family has rights in this matter, Marcus, responsibilities that cannot be ignored for the sake of personal inclination. It was then that Marcus did something that would be remembered in the family's oral history for generations to come." He moved around the table with measured steps, his presence seeming to fill the entire dining room as he approached Cordelia's chair. Without breaking eye contact with his uncle, he extended his hand to her with a gesture that was both invitation and declaration. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the charged atmosphere, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal fell into the candlelit space like lightning striking dry earth, illuminating everything in brilliant clarity while simultaneously setting fire to whatever remained of the careful social order that had governed the evening. Cordelia felt the world tilt beneath her, as if gravity itself had been rearranged by the simple act of speaking those words aloud. She looked up into his face and saw there not just love, but a fierce determination to protect what they had found together regardless of the consequences. In that moment, she understood that he was offering her not just marriage, but partnership in defying a world that would never accept their right to choose their own destiny. "Yes," she said, rising from her chair and placing her hand in his with a steadiness that surprised even her. "Yes, I will marry you." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have substance, pressing against the dining room walls like trapped breath. Then Lord Cornelius exploded into sputtering protests about family honor and social impossibility, while Evangeline sat frozen in her chair as if she couldn't quite believe what she had witnessed. But Lady Margaret, the woman whose mind supposedly wandered in confusion, began to applaud with slow, deliberate claps that echoed through the room like the sound of destiny asserting itself against the forces of convention. The morning brought a stillness that seemed to emanate from the very stones of Thornwick Manor, as if the ancient walls were holding their breath while the consequences of the previous evening's drama settled into whatever new configuration they would ultimately assume. Cordelia woke to find her chamber filled with light that possessed an almost crystalline quality, each dust mote suspended in the golden beams like notes of music made visible. Lord Cornelius and Evangeline had departed before dawn, their hasty retreat accomplished with the kind of strategic discretion that suggested they understood the battle had been lost before they were fully prepared to fight it. The servants moved through the corridors with the careful neutrality of people who had witnessed history being made but weren't yet certain whether they were supposed to acknowledge what they had seen. Mrs. Blackwood's morning visit carried a different quality than any of their previous interactions, her usually impeccable professional distance softened by something that might have been approval or possibly relief. She carried with her not just the morning's correspondence, but news that would change the fundamental nature of Cordelia's position within the household hierarchy. "Miss Ashworth," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of professional propriety, "His lordship requests your presence in the library at your earliest convenience. There are arrangements to be made, announcements to be written, preparations that cannot be delayed if the family is to manage this transition with appropriate dignity." The word transition hung in the morning air like a bridge between what had been and what was yet to come, carrying implications that made Cordelia's heart race with anticipation and apprehension in equal measure. She was no longer simply Lady Margaret's companion, no longer suspended in the liminal space between servant and family. She was about to become mistress of Thornwick Manor, with all the responsibilities and privileges that such a position entailed. Lady Margaret was in one of her clearest periods when Cordelia stopped to take her leave, her eyes bright with an awareness that seemed to encompass not just the present moment, but layers of past and future that existed beyond ordinary perception. She sat by her window with her embroidery finally completed, the mysterious pattern now revealed as an intricate design that seemed to tell a story of love conquering obstacles through patience and determination. "You've chosen well, my dear," Lady Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had observed human nature for 8 decades and learned to recognize genuine emotion when she encountered it. "Marcus needs someone who can see past the armor he wears to protect himself from a world that would use his vulnerabilities against him. You possess that rare gift of seeing strength where others see only gentleness." The observation created a warmth in Cordelia's chest that seemed to spread through her entire being, as if Lady Margaret's approval had somehow validated not just her choice, but her worthiness to make such a choice. She had spent so long defining herself by her limitations that the prospect of being valued for her strengths felt like discovering abilities she hadn't known she possessed. The library, when she entered it, had been transformed from a sanctuary of accumulated knowledge into something that felt more like a chapel where sacred vows might be exchanged. Marcus stood before the tall windows where morning light streamed through glass to create patterns on the Persian carpet that seemed to dance with their own internal rhythm. When he turned to greet her, his face carried an expression of such profound relief that she realized he had spent the night wondering whether the morning would bring regret or reaffirmation. "I wanted to ask again," he said, moving toward her with the careful attention of someone who understood that the most important questions were often the ones that required multiple opportunities for honest response, without the pressure of family politics and public drama. "In the clear light of morning, when you've had time to consider all the implications of what I proposed last night." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes that caught the morning light like stars in a winter sky. "Marcus," she said, using his given name with the confidence of someone who had earned the right to such intimacy, I have spent my entire life accepting what others determined I deserved. Last night, for the first time, I chose what I wanted rather than what circumstances forced upon me. I will not retreat from that choice simply because it frightens people who cannot imagine love existing outside the boundaries they have established. The declaration hung between them like a banner raised in defiance of forces that would seek to diminish what they had found together. He reached for her hands, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like the sealing of a covenant that transcended the merely legal arrangements that would follow. "There will be challenges," he said, his voice carrying the honesty of someone who refused to promise what he couldn't guarantee. "Society will test our resolve in ways we cannot yet imagine. There will be people who will never accept you as worthy of this position, who will spend their lives looking for evidence that our marriage was a mistake. Then we'll prove them wrong," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her conviction. "Every day, in every choice we make, we'll demonstrate that love based on genuine understanding is stronger than alliances built on social convenience. We'll show them what marriage can become when it's founded on respect rather than obligation." The words seemed to release something in him that had been held in careful restraint, and suddenly she was in his arms, held against his chest, where she could feel the rapid beating of his heart that matched the acceleration of her own. For a moment, they stood suspended in the golden light of the library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, while writing the first chapter of their own story. The wedding, when it took place 3 weeks later in the Manor's private chapel, was a study in elegant simplicity that spoke more of genuine emotion than elaborate display. Lady Margaret, resplendent in silk that caught the autumn light filtering through stained glass windows, served as Cordelia's only attendant. The ceremony was witnessed by the household staff, whose faces reflected a mixture of wonder and approval that suggested they understood they were present at something significant. As they exchanged vows before the altar, where centuries of Thornwick family members had pledged their faith and love, Cordelia felt the weight of history settling around them like a mantle that connected their promise to all the others who had stood in this sacred space before them. Yet there was also something entirely new being created, something that belonged uniquely to them and could not be diminished by those who would question its validity. The years that followed proved that love, when it grows from genuine understanding and mutual respect, possesses a strength that can transform not just the individuals who share it, but the very foundations of the institutions they inhabit. Thornwick Manor flourished under their joint stewardship, becoming known throughout the region for its warmth and hospitality rather than simply its wealth and social position. Lady Margaret lived to see the birth of their first child, a daughter whose arrival seemed to complete some pattern that had been waiting decades for the proper elements to align. She held the baby with hands that trembled, not with age, but with joy, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed love triumph over the forces that would have prevented its flowering. As evening light filtered through the nursery windows, casting gentle shadows across the face of the sleeping child, Cordelia reflected on the journey that had brought her from a carriage ride through morning mist to this moment of perfect contentment. She had learned that strength often wears the disguise of gentleness, that the most profound revolutions begin with simple acts of courage, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give the world is the example of two people who chose to love each other despite every argument against it. Marcus found her there as darkness fell across the gardens, his arms settling around her waist with the comfortable familiarity of a gesture repeated countless times, yet never losing its power to create warmth in her chest. Together they watched their daughter sleep. Two people who had discovered that the most beautiful stories are often the ones that begin with someone brave enough to choose love over safety, hope over resignation, and the uncertain promise of tomorrow over the familiar disappointments of yesterday. In the distance, the maze stood silent beneath stars, its geometric precision now softened by years of growth that had allowed nature to claim small victories over human attempts at absolute control. It remained a place of peace and reflection, where future generations would walk and perhaps discover their own truths about the mysteries of the heart and the courage required to honor them. The wind through the hedge walls carried whispers of all the conversations that had taken place within that green sanctuary, all the moments when people had chosen vulnerability over safety and found themselves rewarded with connections that transcended the boundaries others had established as impossible to cross.